Okay, we are recording. So again, we're here to talk about ESG rapid rehousing, kind of do a quick overview of it. Thank you everyone for introducing themselves, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So some of the information, the resources that were pulled for this and that you probably need to be aware of are listed here in this first slide, and you're going to get a copy of the slide so you'll have access to these links and information and to refer to later. So the purpose of the funds is Emergency Solutions Grant COVID-19 funds must be used to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus pandemic within Clark County. Available funds contracted to subgrantees must support households who are experiencing homelessness. So there should be something in your policies and procedures that explains how you either prevent, prepare for, or respond to coronavirus pandemic. And in that, you're getting people housed is one strategy. Getting them off the street would help prevent and respond to that. So. And for this program, we're going to have you start people out at a medium-term assistance. So normally, and that's 3 to 24 months worth of assistance. Normally, you would start people out at a short-term assistance, which is 1 to 3 months. And then if they needed additional assistance, you would go ahead and transfer them over to a medium-term assistance program. But we're just going to, because of the pandemic and you know the difficulties right now with getting employment and the need for longer medium-term assistance, we're going to suggest that for ESGCD that you just start people out on a medium-term program. And if you have questions along the way, just feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask questions, or you can save them for the end. So housing eligibility is defined by the HUD definition of homelessness. The households, and they must lack sufficient resources and support networks necessary to retain housing without ESG assistance. Often referred to to the term, but for this assistance, or if not for this assistance, they would become homeless. This would be a last resort if they had other resources. Homeless verification will be, this form here specifically is going to be used. It actually it lays out all the different types of verification you can use to verify their homelessness, and also speaks about the recertification process. So they do not have to provide income verification or determine income eligibility at entry when they're homeless, but at recertification. So case management, so this includes mileage reimbursement, supplies needed to provide direct services to households. So just to be clear that those fall under the case management line item category for reimbursement. So housing search placement, here's a quick paragraph on what that means, and you know, such as your normal housing, searching for housing and developing an action plan for locating housing, and also helping them remove barriers to housing, whatever that may look like. However, for this program, for the first 30 days from entry onto the program, you can categorize it under regular case management, but then after that first initial 30 days, you will have to categorize that under what is called essential services and emergency shelter. Even though they're not technically in a shelter, it still has to be billed under that line item. And so you will need to track when somebody comes on the program from the day that they actually officially enter your program, and up until 30 days, so you can separate your time and bill it appropriately. Is there any questions on that? Okay. And when we do our monitoring, that's something we're definitely going to be looking for, because we want to make sure that that is billed correctly. So your normal housing stability case management, assessing, arranging, coordinating, and monitoring the delivery of individualized services to facilitate housing stability. Case management requirements: individuals and families experiencing homelessness might not be required to receive treatment or perform any other prerequisite activity, including housing stability case management, as a condition of receiving rental assistance. So if they don't participate, that they would still be eligible to continue receiving assistance. However, you must document your efforts to try and engage them. We often refer to this as the assertive engagement model, where you're attempting to reach out, making sure that you're offering that service. You try to make contact, and it should be several times. With possibly several times in a week, depending on your availability and the needs of the client. So, but at minimum, several times a month. And it should be a various means. Like you could not just calling, you might actually go to their house and try to engage them there. And then the case management should be adjusted to the needs of and barriers that the client is experiencing. So it could be monthly, it could be bi-monthly, it could be weekly, bi-weekly. How often will be determined between you and the client, but please be flexible in your ability to be able to provide the amount of case management needed for them to become self-sufficient. So we want to keep the ratio down to 30-1 or less, so that way we can have more successes, even if it means lower numbers. We want to make sure that people actually graduating successfully off the program. So rental assistance, currently an ongoing rental assistance that does not exceed 24 months and during any 3-year period. So that's the limit of the amount of assistance that you'll be able to provide. And that includes any previous ESG in combination with ESCCD. So rental arrears, you could pay up to 6 months, including late fees of those arrears, which will all be counted towards their total 24 months. However, if you pay that, it must allow a household to obtain permanent housing, documentation to verify housing placement prior to paying arrears, and pass-through attorney fees, court costs, or damages are not allowed. It would just be the rent. So you'll need to determine a rent assistance model. Must have a standard rent assistance model that you follow across the board. An example is often used as 30%. That's not required, but they would 30% of their income would be applied to. They would pay that towards their rent. And an example might be if somebody had 0 income, then 30% of 0 would still be 0. They'd still be paying 0. There's no minimum required payment that they have to make. Should determine rent portion when completing income for all recertification. So if you decide, now you're only required to do the recertification once a year, but if your program decides you want to do it more often, then once you do the recertification of their income, you'll also need to adjust their rent accordingly, depending on your rent assistance model. And we will not be giving a utility allowance deduction by using the Vancouver Housing Authority's utility allowance worksheet, which is much different than has been commonly practiced. Used to be that you would assess what 30% of their income would be, and you would deduct the use the Vancouver Housing Authority utility allowance form to determine their utility deduction. But we're not going to be doing that. Instead, we're going to request that you pay the utility bill in full and not instead of doing the deduction. It is not required that we use the utility allowance sheet. Since we're not doing FMR, we're only doing rent reasonableness. So if we're not doing FMR, it's not required we use that form. We're not going to it's not required that so we can instead just pay the full utility bill. Is there any questions on that?
Yes, I had a question, Tom.
Yep.
What if for some reason the household doesn't want to do that? I don't see this happening very often, but what if they don't want to do that? Would we just still not give them a utility allowance?
They don't want you to pay their utilities.
Like, what if they forget to turn it in? Could we pay for it the next month? Like, I'm just trying to think of sometimes it happens.
So they forget to give you the most recent utility bill, so you don't know the amount to pay. So
Mm-hmm.
it will be up to them to make sure they provide you with an up-to-date utility form, because you're not going to be paying arrears. You're going to be paying ongoing current utilities. So I guess that might be a
And
conversation you'll have to have with them about the importance of providing you with the benefit to them is you're paying 100% of their utilities. And so,
mhm.
as opposed to just a portion. So you might sell it that way.
And then this would include the flat rate of the water, sewer, garbage.
So no, it wouldn't. If there is, well, it depends. If it's included as part of the rent, then you would just then no, you would include you would pay they would pay you would only pay you would pay it as the proportion that you were meant to pay as rent. If it's separate and it's not included as the rent, like it's uh, a flat rate, but it's not included as rent,
Mm-hmm.
then you could pay it, yes.
Okay, and then is there any limit to the type of utilities? Like, could it be for like water as well, like
Water,
the
sewer,
city of
garbage,
Vancouver?
trash,
Okay.
gas. Yeah.
All right. Thank
Okay,
you.
you are. Other housing costs include, and this category includes rent application fees, security deposits, no more than 2 months rent. I think there was some confusion about whether it could have been 3 months rent because there was some language around that. But we'll get to the 3 months rent a little bit later. But right now, as far as regular security deposits, it's no more than 2 months rent. And then last month's rent, but remember that if you pay last month's rent, that goes towards the total 24 months that's allowed. So moving costs such as truck rentals, utility deposits, utility payments for up to 24 months, which includes the 6 months worth of utility arrears, which counts towards their 24 months. And landlord incentives. So landlord incentives, this is where that 3 additional months of deposit comes in. So there's so I Googled some icons for incentive, and apparently a carrot on a stick is somehow incentivizing. So that's what that references. Carrot on a stick. Nobody gets it. The total, that was my attempt to be funny. The total The total of all landlord incentives cannot exceed 3 times the rent amount. So there's actually a landlord incentive form, which I'm going to show you next, which will help explain this process. So you are going to be required to submit that with the reimbursement request and keep a copy of it in the file. So a landlord incentive payment may be paid to a landlord if the payment is reasonable and necessary to obtain housing for those experiencing homelessness. Proper documentation is provided to support payment and shared with the county when invoicing. The total landlord incentive portion of the payment does not exceed 3 times the contracted rent or 2 times the contracted rent amount for a signing bonus. The landlord incentive and security deposit tracking form has been completed. So in addition, this form will need to be completed. Types of incentive include a signing bonus. So it has to be, the verbiage has to be signing bonus. So it can be an additional up 2 times the rent just for them signing on somebody. And this might be helpful in a situation where they're less likely or they were on the fence about allowing somebody, overlooking somebody's history are taking a risk with them because they have significant barriers to housing, this might be very helpful in those situations where they're allowed to. And that might be more relevant like on your smaller landlords. So landlord incentives include security deposits, and that could be up to 3 times the amount of rent, depending on whether or not you've used any of this incentive already, because the total amount that can be used on any given client would be the 3 times. So as long as you haven't already used any of the landlord incentive on something else, you could literally pay 3 times the rent for the deposit using the incentive program, and then 2 times the rent for the regular deposit, equaling a total of 5 times the rent. I cannot imagine that you're going to have to pay in any situation I can think of 5 times the rent for someone's deposit. But if it's a make or break about whether or not somebody's going to get housed, that's available there for you to use. Is there any questions on this? Further explanation? Okay.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So for the incentive, then it can't be like on their move-in costs. It can't be defined as security deposit if it goes beyond the 2. So you would pay like the 2 times a month's rent and a security deposit, and then for landlord incentive, is that just like a separate agreement between
It doesn't have
the
to be a separate
program
agreement.
and the landlord?
It could be like if it's, let's say the landlord charged you 4 times the because maybe there was a high that the client had a lot of barriers, and for them they considered it a risk, so they wanted to charge 4 times the deposit. Normally you would not be able to. You couldn't be able to pay that much, and so here you would pay 2 times half that portion using the ESG funds, and then the other half using the landlord incentive ESG funds. So
okay, so it's just how we code it on our end.
correct, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
And then here's the form. Hopefully this will help. We try to make it as user-friendly and easy to understand as possible. Probably even more so than my explanation. Hopefully you won't have to use this pencil quite as big as this to fill it out, because we have an electronic version that you can fill it out using. And I believe I sent that yesterday, everyone. So fair market rents is waived. The FMR is waived for the ESCCD, but you do have to do the rent reasonableness form. Has to be completed. And so when you're comparing apartments, homes, houses, or duplexes, you should do your best to try and make sure that you're comparing apples to apples as far as same zip code, same type of apartment, or same type of house, same years as best as possible. Often we group them in what's called existing 1979 or older, or new is 1980 or newer. And then same number of bedrooms, and then similar amenities as much as possible. Such a huge variation in amenities. That one's a little more difficult. So just try to do the best you can without bogging yourself down with too many details. So and then you'll need to have a policy written on how you determined what is considered reasonable in comparison to the house that the person's moving into. So what would not be reasonable is if the unit that you're having the person move into is higher than all the other ones that you've compared it to. On the form here, it actually shows the proposed unit, which is this first line, and then 3 other units that you've found or that you're familiar with, or you've identified that are for rent, that are comparable. If your unit is more than theirs, then that is that would not be considered reasonable. And then if anybody's curious, this little sign right here, that means the same as. So I just found that out when I was looking up, doing this PowerPoint. So rent reasonableness tests must be completed at least 1 day before the lease signing, the move-in date, and any rent increases effective dates. So, and then again, you know, when you're doing comparisons, apples to apples, oranges to oranges. Occupancy standards. So maximum allowance of 2 persons per room. Agencies providing ESGCD assistance must establish their own occupancy standards, and they may not exceed 2 persons per room. Additional ESGCD requirements, lease agreement or month-to-month agreement. So there's not a standard lease time frame that you have to abide by, like 1 year or 6 months. It could be either or. Housing habitability standards inspection forms should be used, so that are referred to the HHS. So the HHS has a more stringent inspection for fire safety than HQS. So, you know, it's to meet the habitability standards, prefer you use the HHS. If you are going to use the HQS, it must be done by a certified HQS inspector. Not everybody has those. And so, but HHS does not require a certified inspector. And you must maintain habitability standards for as long as you are providing this assistance. And at minimum, you should be doing another HHS annually. So lead-based paint inspections for units built before 1978 and where their household has a pregnancy or a child under the age 6, annual inspections on this also.
Tom, I have a question.
Sure.
Going back to the occupancy standards, what I've seen before is where property management is not allowing, they have restrictions on how many people can be in an apartment based by how many bedrooms are in the apartment. With this occupancy standard, it allows for someone to move into a smaller apartment, let's say, right, with more family members. So is there anything that would be helpful in negotiating that with property managements?
So the one thing that, and I'll double check on this, but I believe that it's that it used to be that the living room was considered a sleeping room, and that if but I will double check that to make sure that's still the case for ESG. But again, you're right. The individual landlords may have their own standards or requirements that that they were occupancy standards. Unfortunately, that the best you could do there is just negotiate with them. So, but if you had, like, if you knew that the living quarters were considered a sleeping room, then that might be one argument you could propose. So I will get back to you on that one. Does that answer your question somewhat?
Yes, thank you, Tom.
You're welcome.
And then I have a question about the inspections. So there's no training required for that. It's just using the checklist that you shared.
Correct.
Okay.
There is additional document, or I could send you like additional information on it in addition to that. I'll do that, just so you're well versed on what that is. So. Okay. It is a pretty easy checklist, but it's always good to know more. So I'll send that information to you. So here's a copy of the checklist that I sent yesterday. This is the one that actually Commerce had developed using the habitability standards information that I'll be sending you. So see, any houses that are sideways, upside down, or lopsided would not qualify. So that's why they're crossed out here. Kind of a visual. No upside down houses. So here's a copy of the tenant-based rental assistance agreement. The verbiage here kind of mimics what the requirements in the guidelines are and so if you use this form, it kind of meets those standards. The difficulty is in filling this out is that you don't want to commit too far ahead in as far as what you're going to pay. So oftentimes, like agencies will just fill one out for each month that they're committing to paying and making a payment to for them. Once let's say the recertification is coming up, and then that person is recertified, and now they're no longer eligible for ESG, but you've signed this with an end date that goes beyond their exit date because they're now no longer eligible. So having a contract where you've committed to paying when they're not eligible for ESG would not go well. So with that said, my recommendation would be to do one for each month that you're making a payment. So at recertification, the income limit is going to be 30% of the area median income. The household should lack sufficient resources or support networks to retain housing and should be completed no less than once per year, but you can choose to recertify more often but it should be written in your policies, your procedures as to how often, and it should be consistent. So here's a recertification document. Notice that it has here all the different various types of verification that you would use or that you could obtain to determine their annual income and determine their eligibility. And so what this form is asking you is what documentation did you obtain? In addition to a narrative right here in this box about how there's no other resources for them to sustain housing without this assistance. So back in the documentation order of preference, so you should be doing your due diligence and obtaining the proper documentation. You want to get source documentation if at all possible. So you want to get third-party written verification. That should be the standard first and foremost, especially when it comes to employment. In most cases, you should be able to obtain that information. The exception might be somebody who works under the table or is self-employed and might have to have other forms of documentation. So third, if you're not able for some reason to get written verification, then and you've done your due diligence in trying to get it, or the client has done their due diligence in trying to get it, then you would move to the oral verification and contact somebody over the phone with a release in place and do it that way. There is a form for this specifically that I sent out yesterday. And then the last resort, if you've done your due diligence in trying to do both these other processes, then you would move to the self-declaration. And it should always be the last resort. And that's also with certifying their homeless status. This would be the same procedure, whether it is income verification or housing status verification. If you're, it is not uncommon, it's very common that a self-declaration will be used for homeless status, because if they're not accessing normal outreach services or any type of other services or shelter, sometimes it's very difficult and you have to resort to the self-declaration. The good thing is you have the self-declaration available for you in that case. So annualizing income, I like to emphasize the biweekly and the semi-monthly are similar, but not the same. When we are annualizing income, we need to pay close attention to people's page stubs and look at the actual pay periods. Do they get paid every other week exactly, or do they only get paid 2 times a month? Because and when you're doing your calculations, a biweekly calculation is 26 weeks, and a semi-monthly calculation is 24 weeks in a year. So it may make a huge difference on whether or not somebody is eligible or not. You could actually accidentally be providing services to somebody who's not eligible if you get that one incorrect. So when to annualize income? Annualizing income may be necessary when determining the percentage of income that will be applied towards rent. If you're if you're determining rent based on that, and when completing a recertification, rent portion that a household pays should reflect the change in income. We encourage you to use a progressive engagement model where they may, if they haven't got much income to begin with, that they pay a smaller amount and that gradually increases. Here's the income eligibility worksheet. So these formulas here, these 5 bullet points, mimic what is on this form, as you can see here in the middle. These are the approved means of annualizing income, and they should be indicated on this form. The neat thing about this form is, even though you have to manually put in the AMI in the box down here, it will actually turn red if they're over income once you input the calculation. There is a file checklist that has been provided by Commerce, and here's some of the items on that. However, just keep in mind that that checklist is prior to providing assistance. So as long as all these items are in the file prior to paying, then you can go ahead and move forward with the system paying. However, it is not a complete file checklist, and there's a lot of other items that should be included in your file. And we have created a file review checklist for you, so you could make sure that you're meeting all those requirements. So other important information to know is there should be evidence of the household receiving a copy of your grievance procedure or policy, a Washington State mitigation program information, Washington Residential Landlord Tenant Act information, fair housing information, interested landlord list, and here's the link to that that the Council for the Homeless maintains. And you'll get a copy of this PowerPoint, so you'll be able to have that link. When developing a housing stability plan, there should always be referrals to mainstream resources, short and long-term goals, should be client-centered, client choice, based on assessment of the household's barriers and needs, should be housing stability focused, and there should be goals related to dates related to those goals. And sometimes it could be a goal of completion date, or it could be a start date, depending on the type of goal. And then termination requirements, there should be a written notice to the household, and includes a notice of your grievance procedure and evidence of the notice recorded in the file. So evidence that you've sent the notice and evidence that you provide them a copy of the grievance procedure. Any questions? Yeah. Other important information to know. So important dates to remember, the 20% amount expected to be spent out by September 30th, and the 80% for March 31st. Invoices for the period ending June 30th is due by July 8th. The first draft of your policies and procedures should be within 10 days of signing the contract. And then that's just the first draft. So usually it's real common to go back and forth on the drafts as we're fine tuning and getting them updated. Annual and quarterly reports due by the 15th of the following month. Annual additional due dates. So there are additional due dates, but please refer to your contract. I wasn't going to go over every one, but there is a section in there with dates that you can do that. So policy and procedures must include a reference on how funds will support COVID-19 response efforts, such as how you will prevent, prepare, or respond to the coronavirus, rent calculation policy, coordinated entry policy, termination policy, denial policy, grievance procedure policy, confidentiality policy, order of priority for obtaining documentation, which we reviewed earlier, feedback for survey form information, transfer policy that addresses reasonable accommodation requests, and victims against Violence Against Women's Act protections, and rent reasonableness procedures. So I wanted to be as inclusive in this explanation as possible, so when you're developing them, you'll have a reference to go back to. In addition, please refer to your commerce guidelines for assistance in developing some of these procedures. Any questions on that? Here's a copy, just kind of an overview of what the Q&A looks like. It's actually backwards. I got page 1 first, or page 2 first, and page 1 second. But so I just want you to see what it looks like, so you're familiar with it. I did send a copy of it. I will continue to update it and send you copies as I update it, and then I learn new information, or information changes, or I get different guidance. And I'll probably make sure that moving forward, I will make sure that it says version 2 or then version 3, and I will continue to do that so you can identify what's the most recent version of it. The one I sent today would be the most recent version. And that's all I have. Is there questions?
I'm sure there's questions, Tom, but I just really appreciate all the information, and things that we can go back to and reference, and the resources that are available for further clarification. So that's going to be very useful as we put everything together.
You're welcome. Yes, and I hope the forms that I sent you will help clarify some of the of what you need to do and how to help you remain in compliance and provide services.
Yes.
Thanks. And then for share, I know you've been doing this a while, and so I really do hope there was some clarifying information here. I know that it's probably a lot of repeat information, but my hope is that especially around the utility allowance piece. So
Yeah, that'll be new. Yeah, no, there was a lot of good details and clarification on existing stuff, definitely.
Great, I appreciate it. Well, if no one has more questions, I'm always available, and if you just shoot me an email or give me a call, and we can work it out. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the video.